In the 1880s, the American bison went from 10 million to fewer than 1,000. The Telegraph already stretched across the entire continent. Chicago was putting up the first skyscrapers. And in the middle of all that, cowboys were still driving herds of 2,000 cattle along dirt trails in Kansas and Texas. The Old West was living in 2 centuries at the same time. And the facts from that era seem made up precisely because of that. Fact 1. In 1883, there were more dead bison than stars, visible to the naked eye. Before Europeans arrived, around 60 million bison lived on the Great Plains. There were so many that when a herd moved, the ground shook like an earthquake. In just 15 years of organized commercial hunting, that number crashed to fewer than 1,000 animals. Think about that. 60 million reduced to fewer than 1,000. Photographers who went out to the plains in 1883 hoping to capture the last herds found only mountains of bones bleaching in the sun. And here's the detail most people don't know. All that destruction was carried out by fewer than 5,000 professional hunters. A group smaller than the population of a tiny town wiped out more mammals than any event in recorded human history. It was the equivalent of erasing the entire current population of North America in less than 2 decades. It wasn't an accident. It was method, industrial scale, and indifference. Fact 2. Wyatt Earp was working as casino security in 1883. Everyone knows the gunfight at the OK Corral, October 881, Tombstone, Arizona. 30 seconds of gunfire that became legend. But what happened to Wyatt Earp after that? 2 years later, in '83, he was in Dodge City, Kansas, working as security at a gambling hall. That's right. The man Hollywood turned into a national hero was making a living protecting card tables and chips. Back then, there was no pension for former lawmen, no health insurance, no government retirement. A 35-year-old guy with a reputation as a fast shooter used exactly that to pay the bills. The skill with a revolver that nearly got him killed in Tombstone was the same one that paid the rent in Dodge City. That idea of the sheriff hanging up his hat and living peacefully on a porch was invented by movie screenwriters. In real life, men like Earp stayed in the same cycle, because the only work available required exactly what they already knew how to do. Fact 3. In 1877, Alexander Graham Bell's telephone started working commercially. 3 years later, the U.S. already had nearly 48,000 devices in use. By 1886, that number had passed 150,000. But here's the detail most people don't stop to think about. While a businessman in New York could already call the office by phone, a cowboy on the Great Plains had never even seen one of those things, and probably never would during his entire working life. In 1882, Edison opened the first electric power station in Manhattan. Cities in the East already had electricity, streetcars, and telephone lines. Meanwhile, the West was still living practically in the pre-industrial age. 2 Americans born in the same year, living in the same country, at the same moment, existed in completely different eras. The cowboy of 1880 and the Manhattan banker of 1880 shared the same flag, but not the same century. The U.S. was literally 2 worlds at the same time. Fact 4. Buffalo Bill created a show about the Old West, while the Old West still existed. In 1883, William Cody put together a traveling show about the wildlife of the American West. The detail most people don't stop to think about is that at that time, real cowboys were still driving cattle along the trails, and plains tribes were still resisting on the frontiers. Cody didn't invent anything from scratch. He had been a bison hunter, hired by the railroad, an army scout, and a guide for military expeditions. The guy had lived it firsthand and decided to turn it into a show before the whole thing was even over. The troupe traveled across the United States and later crossed the Atlantic, bringing the show to audiences in England, France, and Italy. The cast included real cowboys, sharpshooters, and actual Sioux warriors. In '85, Sitting Bull himself joined the tour, only 9 years after Little Bighorn. The West was being turned into myth while it was still breathing right outside the circus tent. If this kind of history surprises you, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. There's a new video like this every week, and trust me, the next one hits even harder. Fact 5. Jesse James was killed by a member of his own gang in 1882. Jesse James was living in hiding in St. Joseph, Missouri, using the fake name Thomas Howard. He had a wife, kids, and neighbors who had no idea who he was. On the morning of April 3, 1882, while Jesse was straightening a picture on the living room wall, Robert Ford pulled out his revolver and shot him in the back. Jesse was 34. Ford was a recent member of the gang and had already made a secret deal with Governor Crittenden, who had promised $10,000 for Jesse's head. After the shooting, Ford turned himself in, expecting to become a hero. That's not what happened. The public called him a coward. The court sentenced him to hang, but the governor granted him a pardon. The promised reward was never paid in full. Ford spent the next few years trying to cash in on his fame, putting on shows where he reenacted the murder. It didn't last long. In 1892, exactly 10 years after killing Jesse, Ford was shot twice in a bar in Colorado. Fact 6. Coca-Cola was born the same year Geronimo surrendered. In 1886, an Atlanta pharmacist named John Pemberton mixed a dark syrup with carbonated water and started selling it at the pharmacy counter for 5 cents a glass. No one imagined that homemade remedy would become the most recognized drink on the planet. But while Pemberton was serving his first glasses in Georgia, nearly 2,000 miles away, in the Arizona desert, Geronimo, the last Apache leader still resisting with weapons in hand, surrendered to the U.S. Army in September. With that surrender, the last major military campaign against indigenous peoples in the Southwest came to an end. And there's more. That same year, the Statue of Liberty was dedicated in New York and the American Federation of Labor was founded. All of this happened in the same 12 months. An entire country was changing its skin at the same time. Symbols of the future were being born while America's oldest chapter was closing for good. Fact 7. Most people think Wyatt Earp ran Tombstone. He didn't. He was never the sheriff of that town. The man who held that job was Johnny Bean, an open rival of Earp's. Wyatt served as a deputy U.S. Marshal, a federal role, with no direct authority over local matters. That difference changes everything about the gunfight at the OK Corral. It wasn't simply good guys versus bad guys. It was a clash between two spheres of power, federal and local. Earp and Bean were competing for political influence in the region, and each had his own allies and interests. The confrontation grew out of that real rivalry, not some abstract sense of justice. Hollywood merged the two roles into one heroic character because it was easier to sell. But the real Old West operated with overlapping layers of authority that often came into conflict. Local politics in Tombstone was just as complicated as any power struggle in Washington. Fact 8. Pioneers, sod houses, held heat better than wooden ones. This might surprise you. In the 1880s, thousands of families in Nebraska and Kansas lived in houses made from blocks of earth with grass on top. They called them sod houses. And here's the detail most people don't know. These rough-looking buildings kept the inside temperature between 60 and 65 degrees Fahrenheit, even when the thermometer outside was below zero. The walls were 2 to 3 feet thick. They worked like natural insulation that many wooden houses of the time couldn't provide. So why did people abandon these homes? It wasn't because of the cold. It was because of pride and real problems. When it rained for days on end, the earth soaked up water and the inside became damp and dark. On top of that, living in a sod house meant you still hadn't made it. As soon as a family saved enough money, they traded the dirt house for a wooden one, even knowing they would be colder during the plains' winter. Fact 9. The original cowboys were mostly black and Mexican. When you think of a cowboy, you probably picture John Wayne on a horse. But the reality on the cattle trails of the 1880s was very different. Historians estimate that 1 in every 3 cowboys was black. Another third was Mexican. The white cowboy Hollywood turned into an icon was actually a minority in the real hard work. After the Civil War, thousands of formerly enslaved people headed west. Out there, prejudice existed, but it didn't have the same brutal laws as the South during Reconstruction. On horseback, everyone faced the same sun, the same dust, the same risk of death. The pay was the same too. The difference showed up when it came time for promotion, because black cowboys almost never became foremen. This story wasn't hidden on purpose. It simply never interested the movie studios, which preferred to sell a more convenient version of the American frontier. Fact 10. Old West saloons were way more than what the movies show. Forget that classic Western movie scene with a bar, a piano, and a few card tables. The reality was much wilder. Places like the Birdcage Theater in Tombstone, which opened in '81, worked as a bar, theater, gambling house, and brothel, all under the same roof. And here's the part that gets you. That place stayed open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for 8 straight years, without closing once. Upstairs, there was a stage with live shows, acrobats, and magicians. Along the sides, there were private boxes where high-stakes gambling and private meetings happened. In the basement were the rooms of the so-called soiled doves, the prostitutes of the time. Tombstone was a mining town with around 10,000 people and almost no entertainment options. So everything was packed into one place. Deadwood and Dodge City had similar setups. The real saloon was the shopping mall, the theater, and the red light district of the American frontier. Fact 11. The winter of 1886-1887 destroyed the Western cattle industry in a single winter. Before that winter, the cattle business in the West worked in a way that seems insane today. Millions of head of cattle were left loose on the open range all year long, with no fences, no shelter, and no backup food supply. The owners simply trusted nature to handle it, and for years it worked, until it didn't. The winter of 1886-1887 brought temperatures of 40 below Fahrenheit for weeks at a time. Blizzards piled the snow so high that cattle couldn't reach the grass underneath. In states like Montana, Wyoming, and parts of Texas, between 75 and 90% of the open-range herds froze or starved to death. Entire fortunes vanished in a matter of months. When the spring of 1887 arrived, ranchers found plains covered with carcasses everywhere they looked. That disaster forced a complete change in how cattle were raised, with fences, shelters, and stored hay. The age of the great free-roaming herds ended right there. Fact 12. Billy the Kid was only 21 years old when he was killed. Most old. West outlaws were older men, hardened by the sun and the road. Billy the Kid broke that rule. When Sheriff Pat Garrett shot him in July 1881, the kid was only 21 years old, and he already had a record that men twice his age didn't have. He had been sentenced to hang for murder, but escaped from jail by killing 2 guards on the way out. No one knows for sure how many people he killed. The numbers range from 4 to 21, depending on who's telling the story. What we do know is that he was nothing like what Hollywood later showed. He was skinny, short, with crooked teeth. But he had something guns can't buy. People liked him. Friends risked their own lives to hide him for years. That mix of charisma and violence made him a legend before his body was even cold on the ground. Fact 13. Many towns in the West had a photographer before they even had a doctor. In the 1880s, settlements with fewer than 2,000 people got photography studios as one of their first permanent businesses. And there was a very practical reason for that. Mortality was high. People moved around all the time, and no one knew if they would ever see their relatives again. A photo sent to family back east was proof that you were still alive and doing well. That's why the business made money. People paid to pose in the best clothes they had, in a tidy setting, with a serious expression and a strong posture. The result was an image that showed a life more put together than it really was. It wasn't a document of reality, it was personal marketing. You sent that photo to your mother in Ohio, and she slept easy, thinking her son was prospering. Meanwhile, the town might not even have had a place to treat a fever. Fact 14. The Telegraph ended the easy getaway in the Old West. Imagine this situation. You're an outlaw in the 1860s. You rob a bank in a small town in Kansas, get on your horse, and ride about 50 miles to the next county. Over there, nobody knows who you are. Nobody has your description. You start a new life like nothing ever happened. That's how it worked. Now jump to the 1870s. Telegraph poles start crossing the territory from coast to coast. And suddenly, that same robber discovers something unsettling. His physical description, the horse he was riding, the direction he fled, all of that reached the next town in a matter of minutes. He was still halfway there and was already a wanted man at his destination. The Jesse James gang figured that out fast. They started choosing targets in areas where the wires still hadn't arrived. But every month, those places got smaller. The Telegraph did to the Old West what the internet did to the modern world. It eliminated the possibility of simply disappearing. Fact 15. In 1869, Wyoming gave women the vote. But the reason had nothing to do with equality. The Wyoming Territory had a serious problem. Too many men and not enough women. The region was harsh, isolated, and needed families in order to grow. The solution they came up with was practical, offering women the right to vote as a way to attract female settlers to the territory. It was basically a marketing move, and it worked. Now, the most interesting part came later. When Wyoming asked to be admitted as a state in 1890, Congress said it would accept, but on one condition: take away women's voting rights. Wyoming's answer was direct. They would rather remain a territory than give up that right. Congress backed down. Wyoming entered the Union with women's suffrage intact, becoming the first American state to guarantee it permanently. All of this happened 51 years before the 19th Amendment, which only extended that right to the rest of the country in 1920. Fact 16. The first competitive rodeo was in Prescott, Arizona in 888. For decades, cowboys held informal contests with each other after work on the ranches. No rules, no judges, no prize money at all, just pride. But on July 4th, 88, the town of Prescott, Arizona, changed that forever. They organized the first rodeo in American history with registration, paid admission, and documented cash prizes. Cowboys came from ranches all across the region to compete. And here's the detail that stands out. The guy who won the bronc riding took home $25. That may not sound like much, but back then, it was basically a full month's pay for an ordinary cowboy. In a single day, what had always been ranch hand fun became organized entertainment, and Prescott never gave up that title. To this day, the city holds Prescott Frontier Days, recognized as the oldest continuously running rodeo in the United States. Fact 17. Geronimo was never captured. He voluntarily surrendered. 3 times history books say the U.S. Army captured Geronimo. That isn't true. He turned himself in willingly 3 times, in 1877, 1883, and 1886, and each time he negotiated the terms before laying down his weapons. During the final surrender, the situation was unbelievable. Geronimo had only 36 warriors by his side. On the other side were 5,000 U.S. soldiers and thousands of Apache scouts. Even then, he didn't simply give up. He spent days negotiating with General Nelson Miles. The final agreement promised that he and his men would go to Florida for 2 years and then return to Arizona. Geronimo accepted, but the Army broke that promise. He never went home. He lived as a prisoner until he died in 1909 at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. Even surrounded by an entire army, Geronimo was never captured. He chose when and how to surrender. If this kind of history surprises you, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. There's a new video like this every week, and trust me, the next one hits even harder. Fact 18. An 1880 sheriff made less than an ordinary cowboy. Here's a fact most people don't know. In the 1880s, a sheriff in the American West took home between $50 and $100 a month. An experienced cowboy made pretty much the same. So why would anyone take a job where they could get killed any day? Simple. The salary was just the beginning. The sheriff got a fee for every prisoner he locked up, kept part of the fines he collected, and also gained a status that opened doors to other businesses. Wyatt Earp, for example, worked as a deputy marshal in Dodge City while also owning part of a saloon. And that mix of law and personal profit was common. Plenty of sheriffs collected protection money from brothels and gambling houses they were supposed to be shutting down. Some were part of the same criminal networks they had sworn to fight. The honorable sheriff from Hollywood movies did exist, but he was rare. In practice, most of these men lived by balancing interests from all sides just to stay alive and keep the job. Fact 19. Tombstone, Arizona, had an opera house before it had a hospital. In 881, Tombstone was one of the richest towns in the American West because of silver mining. And what did investors build first? A theater, the Birdcage. Theater opened its doors while the town still didn't have a real hospital. That sounds crazy, but it made perfect sense at the time. Miners made good money and spent it fast. A theater could turn a profit in the first week. A hospital was an expense with no return for whoever was investing. That same logic played out in dozens of boom towns across the West. Saloons, gambling houses, and theaters always showed up before churches, schools, and hospitals because they made money. These towns weren't born as communities. They were born as businesses. Social infrastructure only appeared later, when the population grew enough to demand it, or when someone with a sense of responsibility paid for it out of their own pocket. Fact 20. Pony Express. Horses covered 100 miles a day for weeks. In 1860, before the telegraph connected the country, the fastest way to send a message from the East Coast to the West was on horseback. The Pony Express worked like a 2,000-mile relay race from Missouri to California. Each horse galloped between 10 and 15 miles before being swapped out for a rested one at the next station. One rider rode 7 to 10 different horses per shift, covering up to 100 miles before handing the mail off to the next rider. The entire route was completed in about 10 days, but here comes the impressive part. In March 1881, when Abraham Lincoln was sworn in as president, his speech needed to reach California as fast as possible. The riders made the entire trip in 7 days and 17 hours. That averages out to 260 miles a day non-stop. It was the fastest communication system the United States had ever seen. Fact 21. Forget that saloon image where everyone draws their gun and starts shooting. In real life, the owners of those places wanted one thing above all else: profit, and chaos doesn't make money. That's why the best saloons in the Old West operated with clearly defined rules. In many towns, there were local laws requiring anyone to hand over their weapons before going in. Dodge City, for example, already had an ordinance in 1888 banning the carrying of firearms within city limits. That was decades before any federal discussion on the subject. Inside the saloons, security kept watch and stopped fights before they escalated. Serious insults got you kicked out on the spot. Women who worked there were treated with formality in the common areas. The owners knew that customers with money don't come back to places where they might get shot. The reality of the Old West was much more organized than the movies showed. Fact 22. Doc Holliday really was a trained dentist. Before becoming one of the most feared names in the Old West, Doc Holliday sat in a dentistry classroom in Pennsylvania. He graduated in 1872 at age 20 and opened an office in Atlanta. The plan was to have a normal life, but in 1873 he was diagnosed with tuberculosis. Doctors told him he wouldn't last long, so Holliday packed his bags and went to the dry climate of the West, hoping to buy himself more time. The problem was that in frontier towns, patients with toothaches only showed up once in a while. He couldn't live on that alone. He started playing poker and faro to pay the bills, and he was good at it. But he had a short temper. In 8-5, he killed a man for the first time. From then on, the college-trained dentist became a gunslinger. Few people in the West had a college degree. Holliday had one, along with a cough that wouldn't stop and a steady trigger hand. Fact 23. In 880, the U.S. had more railroad track than all of Europe combined. Around 93,000 miles of railroad cut across the country. 10 years later, that number had almost doubled. During the 1880s, Americans laid an average of 6,800 miles of new track every year. To give you an idea, that's like building a line from New York to Los Angeles and back, every year, non-stop. That network changed everything. Texas cattle no longer had to be driven on foot for hundreds of miles. Towns in the middle of nowhere became trade hubs overnight. And who built all of it? Largely immigrants. Chinese workers on the Pacific side, Irish workers on the Atlantic side. They worked in brutal conditions, were paid next to nothing, and many died without anyone ever recording their names. The country that took pride in progress was literally built on the backs of people most others preferred to ignore. Fact 24. Old West outlaws had regular jobs between crimes. This might surprise you. Most Old West outlaws didn't live only off crime. Jesse James tended a farm between robberies. Black Bart, the terror of California stagecoaches, was actually Charles Bowles, a traveling salesman no one suspected. Butch Cassidy worked as a butcher and a cowboy on real ranches at different points in his life. The full-time professional outlaw barely existed. The pattern was different. An ordinary guy committed a crime, often out of desperation or during a fight that got out of hand. Then he had to run. And while hiding, broke and out of options, he ended up stealing again just to survive. One crime led to another. It wasn't a planned career. It was a slippery slope. The guy didn't wake up one day and decide to become an outlaw. He stumbled into it and couldn't find his way back. Fact 25. In December 1890, the 7th Cavalry Regiment surrounded around 350 Lakota Sioux at a winter camp in Wounded Knee, South Dakota. This was the same regiment that had been wiped out at Little Bighorn 14 years earlier. The Lakota, led by Chief Bigfoot, were in the process of surrendering and turning over their weapons. During the collection of the rifles, an accidental shot set off the chaos. The Army had 4 Hotchkiss guns positioned on the hills around them. Within minutes, between 250 and 300 Lakota were killed, most of them women and children trying to run for cover. 20 American soldiers also died, and later investigations indicated that most of them were hit by friendly fire. The detail that still sparks debate to this day is that the government awarded 20 medals of honor to the soldiers involved in the action. As of 2026, none of those medals has been officially revoked. Wounded Knee is considered the last major armed confrontation between the Army and the Plains peoples, marking the end of an era.